welcome to our very first podcast, Chapter 1 Quiz. As you watch this and listen to it, make sure you have your study guide handy. Once again, the benefit of the podcast is to pause, rewind, rewatch, however you want to go through this. But we really would like to emphasize that you use your study guide here as we go through this. First thing to introduce you to the study guide, as you see across the top here, we have the name of the section. So find should be top left corner of your study guide where it says Science Notebooks. First question there, what is the correct format of a prediction in our notebook? And there's two actually, what we can do. We could start it with I think. Explain what you think your answer is to the question. Put the word because and then explain your reasoning. And then we could put I predict. Put because and same thing. Remember, we're not going to put because it'll fly farther. Make sure you explain why would it help it to fly farther, just like an example we had from our paper airplanes. Second question here on this section, what is the summary of what you have learned or what you learned from an experiment called? And that's going to be the conclusion. Finally, and this is an addition, this isn't necessarily on your study guide, but you do need to be prepared to write a prediction. So not only understand the format above, but also be ready to use it. Okay, find the Skills of Science box. What is the definition of observing? These are also should be found in the textbook and the back of your notebook. It's going to be the process of using one or more of your senses to gather information. What is the definition of inferring? The process of making an inference and interpretation based on observations and prior knowledge. Now, it's important to also kind of have an aside here. Some of you early here are not writing the full definition. You're just putting the process of making an inference. That won't be acceptable in the glossary. It's important that you put the entire definition so that you understand it completely and fully for situations like what we have coming up for this quiz. What type of observations deal with numbers? And we talked about the n's that are in the word. And then what type of observations deal with descriptions or labels? And that's going to be qualitative. So we want to match up the n's with number and quantitative, the L for labels or description. Okay, find the final box for this quiz, NASA's Next Shuttle. Definition of predicting is the process of forecasting what will happen in the future based on past experience or evidence. Definition of classifying, process of grouping items together that are alike in some way. Same thing, process of grouping items isn't going to cut it when it comes to our glossary. We got to have the full thing. An independent variable is going to be one factor that a scientist changes in an experiment. Remember, we talked we're only allowed one to take place at a time. You'll also see it called the manipulated variable. Then we have the dependent or the responding variable, and that's the factor that changes as a result of those changes to the independent variable in an experiment. So for instance, when we make a change to something and we're watching, kind of waiting, looking for something, the thing we're looking for is the dependent variable. So in NASA's Next Shuttle, our independent was the change to the plane. In our dependent variable, we really had two that we were looking at, the distance and whether or not it landed safely. A controlled experiment is one where only one variable is manipulated at a time. And examples of data are going to include facts, evidence, and figures, typically numbers. Now, data is not always numbers. It could also be our observations, which would fall under evidence, and then maybe a fact that we find in science that takes place repeatedly. Questions to do in the book. Again, no due date on these. Highly suggest you take just a few minutes, one of the 2 to 3 nights that you're studying leading up to the quiz and just kind of go through them. They're just some good practice. Reminders about study guides. Study guide does not have a due date, but if you want to do well on this quiz, you should fill it out and study it. Study with your parents. Studying by yourself the entire time for a quiz is not the most productive way to study. Study early and often, 10, 15-minute chunks of time. The earlier you do it, the more familiar you're going to be with the information, and your confidence going into the quiz is going to be much higher. Look over all the vocab words we've used this chapter. And again, when we do vocabulary, we will give you the definition. You are going to need to write or choose the correct vocab term that matches it. We don't flip that around the other way. Our purpose is to become familiar with the words and understand the words. We're not about memorization. And then if you're not sure about something that is on your study guide and what you've put, you need to write something first. Don't come to us with a blank study guide and say, I don't understand. You need to come to us first and check your answers, and then we will certainly help you at that point. All right, you have completed your very first podcast. Chapter 1 quiz coming up. Make sure you double check your study guide. Make sure you have everything. Feel free to watch this again. Pause it, rewind it, whatever it takes. Best of luck.